Welcome to Alan Skorsky Reports. I'm Alan Skorsky. Ever since October 7th of 2023, virulent and violent anti-Semitism has swept across the globe, including the United States, Canada, South America, Europe, and now we are hearing more and more about anti-Semitic attacks in Australia. And what is the common thread in all these continents? The rise of Palestinianism and Islamism. While Europe lost its identity years ago, ever since October 7th, the rise of Hamas activism has dominated the streets of every country they have migrated to. Just last week, Max Vifer, an Israeli influencer, gained recognition for his online activities, particularly for recording and sharing conversations he had with two Muslim Australian nurses who boasted about killing Israeli patients. Now, consider these recent headlines from Australia's media. Australia's spy chief warns of rising anti-Semitism and intolerance. And here's another one. Muslim leader links Mossad to surge in domestic anti-Semitic violence. And since November, Australia's Jewish community has faced the following: a trailer filled with explosives and a list of Jewish targets discovered on Sydney's outskirts, firebombing of a Melbourne synagogue with one person hurt, and defacement of another with Nazi symbols and pro-Palestine graffiti. A Jewish childcare center set on fire, 3 Jewish businesses torched, the former home of a prominent Jewish leader sprayed with graffiti, and cars defaced with windows smashed in areas where Jews live. Counterterrorism officials have arrested 12 people in connection with these crimes. Nearly 200 more have been charged since October of 23 in the state of New South Wales, where Sydney is located, with crimes linked to anti-Semitism, police say. Today's guest is Robert Gregory, CEO of the Australian Jewish Association, or AJA. AJA is a national membership-based organization for the Jewish community in Australia. Robert, welcome to the show and welcome to America.
Thank you for having me on, Alan.
Good. Listen, so just to begin, one of the things that I live here in America, so I live in a country that kind of dominates the news media. Canada is to our north, is an ally. They're our neighbor, and then we've got Europe. But so many people, including myself, always saw Australia as part of the other side of the world. So I guess in connection with support for Israel and facing anti-Semitism, how have you folks dealt with it? And do you see yourselves connected to the global rise of Hamas-inspired anti-Semitism?
Well, I never thought I would see Australia at the center of the world media to do with anti-Semitism. It's just never something I imagined. A lot of Jewish people who came to Australia were refugees from the Holocaust. And so the Jewish community here is a bit different to America in that it's mostly descended from survivors of the Holocaust. So they came to escape what was going on in Europe, and they really thought it was the other side of the world. And now it looks like global trends, whether that's to do with immigration or other issues, have caught up with Australia, and we are facing the same issues as other countries, and even worse in many cases.
So, let me ask you, again, politics, as much as I try to keep anti-Semitism and support for Israel away from politics, because it should always be a moral issue and not a political issue, but we know how politics goes. So now our president in America is Donald Trump, and he's considered one of the most pro-Israel presidents in history. Last 4 years we had Joe Biden, who was very kind of, one day he's pro-Israel, the next day he's very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And I've been doing some reading up on your Prime Minister Albanese. And on the one hand, he'll condemn anti-Semitism, but it's always parsed with also condemning Islamophobia, as if there's a moral equivalence, which is what we had here in America. Tell us, about, in your country, or at least as far as the Jewish community is concerned, how has he been as a prime minister? Do you see him being active? Is he paying lip service? Is he trying to balance the Jewish vote versus the Muslim vote? What's going on?
Well, anti-Semitism and support for Israel were never political issues in Australia. There's a history of bipartisan support for Israel and the Jewish community. In fact, Albanese's party, the left-wing Labour Party, was in power in 1948 and voted, because alphabetically voted as one of the first in support of Israel. So they're very proud of that history. But in recent years, there's been a major shift within the left-wing Labour Party, and it's moved now against Israel and against the Jewish community. This actually started with the election of the Albanese government. So before October 7, they were elected in 2022, and they immediately began making hostile moves. So they reversed the previous government's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They changed the votes in the UN. They increased funding to UNRWA, many other measures. And this was even before October 7. But following October 7, that's when it's been most clear that there's been a real weakness in leadership. Australia, just hours or a day after the October 7 attacks, an anti-Semitic mob gathered at the Sydney Opera House, and the police warned the Jewish community to stay home, and they allowed this mob to chant slogans. Many people heard the phrase "gas the Jews."
Right.
The police later claimed, in fact, that was not what they heard, that it was "where's the Jews," which is also not a good thing to be hearing. But the government's leadership since then has been very weak. So you raised an interesting issue, whether it's to do with weighing up the votes. Australia has a very large and very quickly growing Muslim population. It's probably over 1 million now. The Jewish population is much smaller and hasn't increased in a long time. The census shows just under 100,000 Jewish people, but it's probably a bit higher as not everyone puts their religion. It might be about 120,000. So there's many seats now, many electorates in Australia where the Muslim vote is quite decisive. Many government ministers rely on that vote. And we've actually seen there's been the rise of Muslim political advocacy in Australia. They're forming their own party, they're running independent candidates, so challenging the government even more from the left. So a lot of people have speculated that's one of the motivations why the government has been slow to act.
Yeah, so you know what, you raised some very interesting points here. See here, and again in America, there are certain pockets. Our system is a little different than yours. We don't have coalition governments, but we do have electoral college where states, the majority of a state, all the votes or all the delegates go to to the winner. So, for example, here, say in Detroit, Michigan, in Dearborn, Michigan, it's the largest Palestinian population outside the Middle East. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, those were our past president and vice president, they were trying to walk a very, very thin line about support for Israel to not offend the Jewish voters. And then at the same time say, well, we don't like what's happening in Gaza to appease the Arab voters. And of course, that line never works. Here also in America, but we also have allies. There's a very large Christian evangelical movement here that's very, very influential. They have a lot of votes. Do you have natural allies in Australia, or are the Jews kind of left to fend for themselves?
We do have allies, but they're a lot smaller than you guys have in America. So we do have evangelical Christians, but they're a very small movement. My organization works with them, with the Australian Christian Lobby. There's many issues we agree on, but they just don't have the same influence. We also work with other groups that have faced persecution from Islamic extremists. So we work with Hindus, we work with the Iranian diaspora here, people that have fled the Islamic regime in Iran, and various other groups. And I mean, also in America, the Jewish community is quite large, whereas in Australia, we just don't have that. So it's been quite hard to feel like we're being listened to by the government.
So let me ask you a question, because, again, I've always felt safe here in America, but for a lot of me, my friends, my peers, we see the writing on the wall. I'm 62, even though I don't look it. And I've grown up, from the age when we had Ronald Reagan as president and through the different phases. But this is the first time that me and many of my peers have seen the writing on the wall. And even though we've got Donald Trump in now, we know that doesn't last forever. And, your faith has to be in God and not any politician or elected official. What is the feeling now with the Jewish community? Again, in America, a lot of Jews do feel safe-ish. Not totally, but they feel safe-ish. If you don't have that many allies and you're so outnumbered, like 10-1 almost, what is the feeling when you go to shul? Do you have security guards there? Do you talk amongst yourself saying, how are our kids going to grow up? Do you talk about, forming some type of either security forces of your own? how does the Jewish community, I guess, navigate knowing that they don't have the support of the government the way they feel that they should to be protected?
So there's real concern in the Jewish community. Jewish institutions are very heavily protected. We have our own security, so children coming to school walk past armed guards, which is very unusual for Australia, because another difference with America is we have very restrictive gun laws. So people can't even protect themselves if they wanted to. But the Jewish community, yeah, I mean, our institutions are like fortresses. After the explosives were discovered that you mentioned in that caravan and following several attacks, there was very heavy police patrol. So every night for several weeks, we would have helicopters flying for many hours over the neighborhoods where Jews live, with searchlights, which is quite a different experience, not something you'd expect in Australia. There's fear in the Jewish community. I know of several people, and there's obviously more that are slowly making plans for because we've got an election coming up, which is due by May. So if this current government is re-elected, I think we will see a bit of an exodus, probably to Israel. So there's people who are now purchasing property or learning the Hebrew. They're not immediately fleeing, but they're starting to make sure their passport's up to date. These type of things. That's the level of concern there is.
So it's interesting because I was doing again, just reading articles from Australian press and some names I came across. A guy named Warren Mundine listed. He was here I guess, in Washington recently for a conservative conference. Glenn Colommates, who's a Senate candidate for North South Wales, and Mr. Dutton, also, I think who's running for prime minister. Do you have good relationships with these candidates?
Yeah, so all those three people we're very close with. Warren Mundine is a member of the Aboriginal community here. He's very supportive of Israel and the Jewish community. He's been a speaker at our events. And that's another interesting community because a lot of the younger generation is now moving against Israel, but some of the older generation, which Warren represents, and some of the more Christian people in that community are some of our best allies. Then Peter Dutton, the opposition leader here, someone else we're very close with. I've met with him. If he was in power, it'd be completely different. It'd be like the Trump election. The Jewish community would feel much more safe. And Glenn Colommates, again, a non-Jewish supporter of Israel who's running now for the Senate. He spoke actually at our event within the last couple of weeks. And he's a man with a military background, very supportive of Israel. And we found that many people who have served in the Australian military, which I think would probably be similar to America, are also some of our biggest supporters because they understand Islamic terrorism and they understand some of the issues that the Jewish community faces.
Right. So let me ask you another question. Media, because media always plays, especially well, social media is of course is its own beast, but let's say national media. Here in America, we have Fox News. That's the pro-Israel network. I've seen Sky News. I've seen the Kenny Report and the Bolt Report and some of the other shows there, and they seem to be very hawkishly pro-Israel. Do you have a relationship with them? Because I think I saw recently there was some type of event. There was one of the Jewish groups, I don't know if it was yours or not, but another Jewish group together with Sky News to talk about anti-Semitism. How big a player are they in the grand scheme of Australian media?
So the media environment in Australia is quite left-wing, quite anti-Israel. We have a very large public broadcaster called the ABC, which receives over $1 billion each year from the taxpayers. It's very anti-Israel. Then some of our major newspapers are also anti-Israel. But we do have this breath of fresh air you mentioned. So Sky News, which is owned separately to Sky News in the UK, it's actually owned by the Murdoch family, the same owners as Fox News. Right. So it takes quite a similar line, and they're some of our best friends. So you mentioned the Kenya Report, the Bolt Report. I've been on both of those shows. They're very close to our community. And the Murdoch media in Australia, they also own several newspapers, the Australian, the Daily Telegraph, which are supportive. So I would say it's probably about 70% very hostile and about 30% we have these few outlets which are supportive. Although Sky News in Australia, it's a subscription cable TV, so people have to choose to get it. So I don't know how many watch it, but I do know that they're very big on social media. So they afterwards post clips, and I believe they may be the biggest media outlet in Australia on YouTube and following when it's actually shown.
Now, I want to go back to the earlier story that I mentioned in my monologue about those two nurses. See, about 3 years ago, I did a show, and because there was one Muslim, I don't know where she's from, but certainly Muslim or an Islamist. She was an intern at a hospital in Cleveland, and she put out a tweet that she's going to, poison her Jewish patients, and we did a show on that. And I said then, you think it's only one person? No, this is only one person who was dumb enough to do something publicly and think they could get away with it. It's very widespread, and there's an organization here called Canary Mission. They monitor everything that's going on. And they post their names, what they said, where they work, and everything like that. How big now? Besides the two nurses, because again, if you see it once, it's one of 100. It means that there are 100 more who were smarter than them to say something so public. How big of a problem have you seen, or is this the first time you've ever seen healthcare professionals from the Muslim community making threats like this?
So yeah, these two nurses were pretty stupid. They allowed themselves to be recorded saying it, but their views are certainly more widespread. We know of several doctors, nurses that they may not have explicitly said they'll kill Jewish patients, but they've expressed support for terrorist groups and anti-Semitic things, and the regulators here have refused to take action. But we also saw the reaction from the Muslim community here. So mainstream Muslim organizations banded together. They signed a letter saying that it was an overreaction, that it was overblown, this nurses scandal. So pretty much supporting them, which is very concerning. And then we also had a film crew went into that neighborhood, the Bankstown neighborhood, and just interviewed Muslim people on the street. And it was quite shocking to find that random people they approached were also supportive of the nurses. So it is symptomatic of a wider problem and something we'd be very concerned about.
Do you have that video? Because I would love to see it.
I can send it to you. Yeah, it should be able to locate it.
Now, another thing, college campuses. Now, again, I went to college in the 80s. There was no Palestinian Authority then. There was no Hamas. There was the PLO, which at the time was not recognized by the West or by the US, so they were a terrorist organization. And there was no social media back then. Today, of course, there's the Palestinian Authority, which gained legitimacy in 1993 because of the Oslo Accords. So now Palestinianism is considered a mainstream movement. And again, they've been dominating college campuses for decades. It's not just the students, it's also the faculty. How are the universities in Australia with regards to also Islamist and Muslim anti-Semitism? And how much of a stranglehold do they have there?
The universities here have handled it particularly poorly. Following the encampments we saw across colleges in America, we also saw similar in Australia. These sprung up. They were a bit of a mix between some very far left communists, anarchist type people, and then Islamic groups, which actually caused a bit of conflict over some issues. So in one university, they set up two encampments with a bit of distance from each other because they disagreed on the whole trans issues. But yeah, the universities handled this poorly, and it particularly affected some of our most preeminent universities. So the University of Sydney, the Australian National University in Canberra. The government also refused to hold a judicial inquiry into what was going on universities, which is something that, the Jewish community asked for, the opposition asked for, but they just refused to. It's not a coincidence that the education minister in Australia also represents one of these electorates I mentioned, which has a very large Muslim population. So he has not been very outspoken. So we've heard from Jewish students that they're scared to attend campus, that they cover up their Magen David necklaces. We know of classes that have been interrupted by protesters, all sorts of incidents like that. So it's a major concern.
No, listen, we have it here also, but again, we've been fortunate, again, for the time being, because I say that, our luck is going to run out one of these days. But right now, again, I look back when last summer, when there were hearings before Congress, and I don't know if you know Elise Stefanik. She's a congresswoman from New York, and now she's the U.S. ambassador to the UN. she tore into these college presidents where they were eventually forced to resign. So again, here we are having a modicum of success. I think it's much worse in Canada. And again, from what I'm seeing, and tragically, what I'm hearing in Australia is that you guys are, your hands are being tied. You don't have any, you have very few resources to help you. Well, I guess what are students doing then at the end of the day? Medical schools, law schools are they still thinking about going? Is it dangerous for them to go to medical school?
So the Jewish student organization, we've got one main organization across Australia. It doesn't really like to confront these issues head on. It's a bit timid, which is an issue. We've recently had Stand With Us. The international movement has set up in Australia, and that's been much better on campuses. But Jewish students, they're avoiding some of the worst universities, so they're sort of self-segregating to places they consider safer. And I guess, I mean, I'm not sure there's too much physical danger. There may be a little bit, but there's certainly a lot of fear and concern, and people who are changing their schedule. We know of people that are deferred their courses. They'll do it later, or they're trying to learn it online, so they don't have to attend campus. So taking measures like that.
Also here in America, one of the threats, and I've called this out a lot over the years, are members of the Jewish left. And those are the ones who they can't stand up for Jews without standing up for other people also, even though those other people are traditionally our enemies. So here we have groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, J Street, which bills itself as a pro-Israel organization, but they lean hard left. And I don't remember the names of the groups I read in Australia, but I did see some quotes saying that we shouldn't blame the government, or, if we're going to, call it anti-Semitism, then we also need to call out Islamophobia. And I have found that some of our greatest enemy, the greatest threat to our survival, are coming from left-wing Jews here in the US and also in Canada. Do you have, is that widespread in Australia as well?
So Australia's always had a very small group of far left Jewish people that, were dafkaniks, went against the community, but they were never taken too seriously. A lot of them, were much older. They're from the days of, protesting the Vietnam War, these type of things, communist, socialist. But recently, following October 7, there's been a much more concerning phenomenon. We've seen the formation of a new group. They call themselves the Jewish Council of Australia. They formed literally within the last year. They claim to represent the Jewish community. They do this by basically they sent around a petition asking, who has concerns about the current leadership, and they got a few hundred signatories, and many of them are anonymous. Some of them we know are not Jewish. Their name is Muhammad or something, but they claim based on this list that's their mandate. And pretty amazingly, as soon as they were created, they've been given a very big platform, particularly by the public broadcaster I mentioned, the ABC. They're often interviewed, even though they represent less than 1% of the Jewish community here. So it's a big concern. And they're quoted, obviously, every position they take is the opposite of what the majority of the Jewish community would take. Anti-Semitism, they say it's not an issue. Israel's the problem. There's a lot of suspicion that they're coordinating behind the scenes with the Palestinian Arab groups here. So I would say it's a concern. We also have the New Israel Fund. They're not as bad, but they do a lot of bad work, and they do downgrade the image of Israel and the Jewish community here.
Isn't it, my heart breaks for you guys. So let me see one last question, because I know we're running out of time here. Australian Jewish Association. You have a very impressive website. I've gone through all the different tabs on it. You guys do a lot of great work. Talk a little bit about your organization, how it started, your membership, what you do, and, what was the trigger that got you guys saying, we need to form our own group because we're getting clobbered here?
So the Australian Jewish Association was set up in 2017. Across the country, people came together and they said there had been a problem with the current representation. It was moving too far to the left on issues domestically and internationally. So AJA is the only major Jewish organization in Australia that will say no to states, that does not support the creation of a Palestinian state. And on many issues, we take a different line. During judicial reform, the other Jewish organizations were very critical of the Israeli government. And we said, look, this is a matter for Israel. It's not a good idea to be constantly attacking the Israeli government in Australia. It's creating issues, various things like that. AJA grew very quickly. We now have thousands of members. People can take out membership, and mainly our growth also has been on social media. So on whichever social media it is, whether it's X, whether it's Facebook, AJA is the biggest Jewish organization in Australia. On Facebook, we have about 70,000 followers, which for an organization in Australia, I mean, I don't think there's anything that's at 10% or 15% of that. And I think that is actually a very optimistic message, because it shows that, just speaking on principles, saying these things like Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, not being afraid to call out Islamic anti-Semitism, far-left anti-Semitism. This connects with the majority of the Jewish community, the silent majority. The president of AJA, Dr. David Adler, he often likes to say that people vote with their clicks. So when no one's watching them, they choose what they want to follow. And I think that's a message that can be learned in many communities in the diaspora, that speaking with principle, standing up for what's right, will be well received by the Jewish community.
Robert Gregory, it's been an absolute honor and a privilege to speak with you today. We wish you guys all the success, all the hatzlacha. If we can ever help you, you got your brothers on this part of the world. We'd love to help you guys any way we can. You guys are doing fantastic work, and I want to congratulate you. I saw all the speakers you brought in, from the ambassador David Freeman to Carolyn Glick to Itamar Marcus. You've got great connections there, and utilize them.
Thank you so much for having me on, Alan, and for the important work you do. Thank you.
Thank you.